Let's first talk about what sutures are. Sutures are immovable articulations, and you're only going to find them in the skull. That's the only place you're going to find a suture. They develop in the fetus, the skull of which you can see here in this figure. The bones will eventually interlock and form a tight articulation, a tight immovable articulation, which is especially important as the skull will primarily serve protective function for various delicate organs, including, of course, the brain. In this figure of a developing fetus, you can see there are two frontal bones, two parietal bones, and one occipital bone in the back. What's going to happen eventually to the two frontal bones is that they're going to join and then form an articulation called a suture. And you can see in this mature skull the suture that forms. In this case, it would be called a frontal suture. It's also known as a metopic suture. However, this suture normally does not appear in a mature skull because what happens is that the bones eventually fuse so completely that there is no evidence that there were ever two separate bones. And then you have an immovable articulation, which is referred to as a synostosis. We'll talk about various kinds of articulations in a future video. But typically, you will find sutures between bones, and here's an example. This would be referred to as a frontonasal suture. And this is the way that sutures are typically named, according to the bones between which they form a boundary. So here on the superiorly, we have the frontal bone joining by way of a suture to the nasal bones, and so you have a frontal nasal suture. However, we're going to also see sutures that have names that are not derived from the bones that they border, but are associated with something else. And this is an example. This suture here, which you find between the frontal bone and the two parietal bones, is referred to as a coronal suture. And it's a suture that you're going to find in the coronal plane, which is also known as the frontal plane. And the reason it's called a coronal suture is because of its resemblance to a crown, or its association with the location in the head where you might find a crown. Now, you might be familiar with a crown as encircling the crown of the head, which would be somewhat horizontal in relationship to the head. But remember that a crown doesn't necessarily have to be horizontally placed. You can have a crown that is somewhat vertical, like, for example, a tiara is kind of like a crown, and it would be vertically placed. And here you have a statue of Augustus, who was the first Roman emperor. And you see him in this statue crowned by a wreath of laurels, which was honorary in those times. And you can see here in this bust that the laurel wreath is placed vertically on his head, pretty much in the orientation that you find the coronal suture. The next suture we'll talk about is the one that forms between the two parietal bones. And this suture forms exactly in the middle of the skull, along the sagittal plane. And here's the mature skull with the resulting suture. And here in this disarticulated skull, you can see the two parietal bones that form the sagittal suture separated from one another. And here again is the location of the sagittal suture. And let me talk about why it's called a sagittal suture a bit. The word sagittal derives from a Latin word which means arrow. And if you're familiar with the sign of the zodiac Sagittarius, you'll know that this sign represents the archer. And the archer, of course, will shoot arrows. So why is this suture, which is in the vertical midline of the body, separating the body into right and left halves, why is this referred to as the sagittal suture, which has something to do with an arrow? Well, I don't really know for sure, but the explanation I like is if you look here at the fetal skull, and look at what are called the soft spots, also known as the fontanelles, that are present in the fetal skull before the skull fully matures, you'll notice that the anterior fontanelle has a resemblance to an arrowhead. I like to think that the word originated from the anatomist's understanding of how this suture forms. Perhaps an anatomist looked at the fetal skull and saw the resemblance of the anterior fontanelle with the soft spot in the developing sagittal suture, thought of it as being an arrow, and that's the reason they refer to this as the sagittal plane, again, because of its resemblance to an arrow. Now, I can't guarantee that this is true. I'm not a scholar, but if it helps you remember the name, so much the better. The next suture we'll talk about is the suture between the occipital and the two parietal bones. This suture is called the Lambdoid suture. Here we can see it with a photograph of a plastic skull, which I had to colorize in order to bring out the suture. And you can see, if you follow the line of the suture, it forms an upside down V. Here is a figure that shows the suture more clearly, and also shows you why it's called the Lambdoid suture. It is called this because of its resemblance to the Greek letter lambda, particularly the capital letter lambda. And so here you can see the capital letter lambda, and it's not hard to see how the anatomist, when he looked at this suture, how it reminded him of this Greek letter. We can't leave the lambdoidal suture without talking about something that is very often found along this suture, which are Wormian bones. These bones occur within the suture as distinct separate bones. These bones are called Wormian bones in order to honor an anatomist from Copenhagen. They're also known as sutural bones, so if you refer to them as sutural bones, that's perhaps more descriptive. The final suture we'll talk about is located between the temporal bone, the squamous portion of the temporal bone, and the parietal bone. Here you can see it disarticulated in this disarticulated skull. And here is a figure that illustrates it very nicely. The red line indicates the location of this squamous suture, also known as the squamosal suture. And the reason it's called the squamosal suture is because it happens to be on the squamous part of the temporal bone. This concludes this video, and if you'd like to take a quiz, there is a quiz link in the description below. And here are the image attributions. The links to these images are also in the description below.